Hi, my name is Sheldon Croome, President and CEO of Atlas Growers, and you're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go? The smoke rings I blow each night.
Hello, listener, and welcome back to the Professionally Cannabis Podcast. I'm Johnny Weiser, and with me over the interwebs because of the coronavirus lockdown is our co-host, Oscar Houseman. Oscar, how are you getting along today?
Hello, Johnny, all the way over there in not here. It is very locked down today, has been yesterday, and tomorrow we're also forecasting a bit more lockdown, so I'll be sitting tight.
Well, in between those showers of lockdown, hopefully listeners are going to be able to listen to the pod interview that we have today. And Oscar, who is this week's interview with?
Well, today's guest is Sheldon Croome, CEO and President of Atlas Growers, based out of Canada, but with some interesting European footprint and expansion plans. I was really happy to have him on the show. Johnny, weren't you?
Absolutely. Thought it was a great chat, and Sheldon gave us some real good insight into what it's like to be a Canadian-based operator, but actually have physical operations in Europe. So without giving away too much more of the interview, let's get into it. Listeners, enjoy.
Where do they go? The smoke rings
Today, Oscar and I are delighted to be joined by Sheldon Croome, President and CEO of Atlas Growers, a Canadian medical cannabis producer with a footprint in Europe, namely Denmark. Really looking forward to hearing what you're working on. So Sheldon, welcome to Professionally Cannabis.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Sheldon. And as we practice our oat Corona-led, inspired studio, I just want to know what led you to the plant, although no one's going anywhere right now.
You know, what brought me to the plant was its amazing possibilities on the medical front. So the ability to discover and prove the medical science that is behind the plant. And that's really what drove me into the business in the first place, with a research focus and the intent of bringing a new and more natural healing solution to people across the world.
And I think we can probably get into some of the research that Atlas Growers is doing with Harvard and the University of Alberta, perhaps a bit later. But for our listeners to understand more of you as a person, was your background scientific? Was it personal story that brought you here? How did you get involved?
Yeah, so glad you asked. My background is education-wise more in the finance and legal side of things, but I've been a serial entrepreneur really since the early days of my life. I got into this because ultimately a family member was fighting cancer and began treating it with a cannabis formulation. And actually that was about 7 years ago now. Medical cannabis has been legal in Canada for quite some time, and he is Canadian. So ultimately, that treatment led me to wanting to discover and prove the science behind the plants, as he is still alive today. And there was some very interesting results with regards to the tumor growth that coincided with his treatments. And really, it's just the problem was that was all anecdotal, and there had to be some way of proving the science.
And for folks that are less familiar with Atlas Growers, would you be able to give us an overview of the organization, what you guys are doing, and where you're operating?
Absolutely. So Atlas was originally founded in Canada near Edmonton, Alberta. We currently operate a facility there that is just under 40,000 square feet, or say 4,000 square meters. In that facility, it's fairly laboratory-esque. In fact, it is essentially a large lab where we do cultivation, propagation, as well as downstream formulation and processing. So we will take the plant and we'll break it down into its individual components using our flash chromatography systems. We also have on-site analytics where we can analyze potency results and different types of terpenes and everything like that. So it gives us the ability to really work with the plant most accurately. And then from there, do clean formulation science. So bringing together different components of the plant in order to create truly effective formulations that have proper active compounds in it. Atlas also last year acquired a facility in Denmark, previously a mushroom farm, actually. So it's an indoor cultivation facility, mirroring quite similar, in fact, to our Canadian operation. So in other words, we would have individual microclimates that ensure consistent and clean cultivation. In fact, in Canada, so clean that, and we expect to do the same in Denmark, that we don't need to use practices like irradiation, which I know is something that's quite sought after as far as the medical market goes.
What was it about Denmark that really appealed to you and Atlas Growers in terms of formulating your European footprint? I know in the past, previously, both Oscar and I have been complimentary of the Danish trial program and the model that they've been rolling out, but really keen to hear about why Atlas Growers were attracted to Denmark and what the process was like opening a facility in a new continent.
The reason why Denmark was the right option for Atlas was because of, I'd say, multiple factors. The process, to maybe start there, was actually relatively simple and concise as far as what they expect from the corporation that's hoping to get licensed for medical cannabis production. Now, that's barring some of the EU GMP factors, which are obviously a little bit more complicated and time-consuming comparatively to the licensing itself, no matter where you go. There's, of course, challenges with trying to open up overseas. Like, you need to have local talents and business professionals that understand the local environment, the local language, many other small factors that come into that. But the reason why Denmark ultimately became the right choice was because of the fact that they have clean and sustainable energy that is relatively low cost in comparison to much of Europe. Cannabis cultivation does require a fair bit of electricity, and so getting it for the right price helps reduce at the end of the day, cost of that medicine when you get it to the patient. On top of that, there's really just favorable laws regarding cultivating THC. So there's no real restriction on the percentage of THC that you can have in cultivation, which is important for us because, at least in my opinion, and this is yet to be proven, I believe that THC is a key component in certain medical formulations. So for us, having the ability to cultivate products that do contain THC, which of course we could strip out with flash chromatography systems, but for certain medical formulations, that THC is a key component. So being able to cultivate at a high percentage, and Atlas's flower ranges from about 21 to 32% THC. We work with other partners for producing CBD varieties. So our focus is really on the terpene content and different lesser known cannabinoids, such as CBG, THCV, and CBC, which we're putting into certain trials right now. But yeah, those are kind of the key components: the electricity, the flexibility, and the fairly streamlined licensing process.
I'd want to challenge you there on the cost as a consideration, just because, I totally understand the other points. And I think that must have been what drove you, the strategic placement and the regulatory environment, and the fact that it's designed for both patients and companies. But in terms of cost, surely Denmark isn't that affordable when everyone's salary is so high. And I believe I saw in the PR that you're going to have 100 jobs there. I think you probably could have had a cheaper facility elsewhere, no? Or does that not really impact you when it's at this volume or scale?
No, you are correct. There's definitely the labor costs. That's the biggest cost ultimately of doing anything in Denmark, just because of the way that their system works. And, there ultimately isn't really a minimum wage. And whatever that minimum wage is quite high in comparison to especially North America, but even much of Europe and the rest of the world. One of the key things that we can do there is we can take advantage of their robotics and automations cluster. So whilst we're going to be generating those jobs aren't all related to a cultivation facility. They're kind of related more to some of the other corporate activities, distribution activities, and other associated activities. So it's really not, say, a direct cost to the actual cultivation of the plant. Whilst it might seem on the surface like that would be a quite large expense, it's actually not as bad as one might think, because we're taking advantage of automated systems that we've already developed in Canada and using them in collaboration with the Danish and their robotics cluster to take advantage of the fact that we don't actually need as many hands to touch the plants, which can keep the costs still relatively low. But you are correct. You could, in Portugal, say, open up a cultivation facility and have lower input costs on the human side. But certain other costs kind of add up, and the framework poses a risk that we decided to mitigate by setting up somewhere that didn't seem to have those inherent risks.
And is the plan for the Danish facility for this to be Atlas Growers' main base inside Europe, or is this likely to be the first of a number of facilities across Europe? And if not, and I know there's now 3 questions in one, which regions within Europe and which countries within Europe are you really looking to serve out of that cluster that you have in Denmark?
So the Danish facility is meant to serve as our primary European processing hub. So we would basically manufacture, if you could call it that. So cultivate and then also downstream formulate and process there. But it's not necessarily meant to be a major corporate head. You intend to retain most of the corporate side of things, at least from a primarily decision-making level from our Canadian corporate office here in Alberta. But we do have a strong corporate team that we're assembling in Denmark that will help us to just kind of navigate the legal framework overseas. Across Europe, though, we don't intend to open up a number of cultivation and processing facilities. We're a big believer in simplicity, so a little bit more scale, but within a limited number of locations. So really right now, our focus is just Canada and Denmark as far as cultivation and production of different formulations. We do have a bit of a strategy that's working out quite well for us with regards to basically disseminating our genetics. So providing our genetics to cultivators that require or have a need for properly phenotyped and stable genetics that can meet things like GMP EU conditions, which require very low variability in the plant, which is very difficult to do. So what Atlas is doing is providing that knowledge base, so helping cultivators and processors kind of design their systems and their SOPs. And then we provide them with the genetics that are already stabilized. In turn, we actually then retain the ownership of those genetics. So we can actually then channel those through our distribution channels.
How much can you talk to without giving away your proprietary methods? How big are your rooms? I know the Danish grow, it was quite small, right? 35 or so individual in the larger facility. Do you have a mixture of environmental, genetic, and physical controls? How do you keep it stable enough for the German market demands?
It's truly all of those factors that you named. Environmentally, it's important to control every factor, temperature, and adjusting the said temperature to be able to match the cycle of a season is quite important as well. I am not a cultivator, so I will be very upfront about that. I can give you some high level information, but I wouldn't be able to give you IP if I wanted to on that side. That would be
safer that
way. But we control every factor. So temperature, carbon dioxide levels, which is crucial. I mean, that's your plant food, humidity levels, and different humidity levels depending on the cycle of growth for the plant. So from the day it's propagated as a baby plant or a clone to a mature plant with flowers. And then post-processing is incredibly important. So the minute you harvest that plant, it's very crucial that the plant's treated properly. Otherwise, you'll end up with not only stability variances, but loss of terpenes. You may have inadvertent conversions of certain cannabinoids to less favorable cannabinoids, which ultimately alters the way that that medicine should work for the patient. So it's really a combination of high controls. So making sure that you're hitting every nail on the head through the cultivation process. And then post-processing, I could never stress how important that part of it is.
How important do you think it is for cannabis producers that are coming over to Europe to be able to not just ensure the stability and consistency and quality of the product, but be able to ensure the right levels of supply for those who need it, for ultimately a number of patients? You know, it's no secret that last year, sort of midway through the Danish pilot program, that supply became an issue. And actually, for a few months, there was a real short drop in the uptake and usage of medical cannabis within the Danish program. How important is it for a company not only to ensure that the quality of their product, but to maintain that sort of strong supply chain?
You know, from my perspective, being patient-centric, I think that it's incredibly important, not just in Europe and Germany, but, you know, all over the world. I think that's something that's really critical for companies to care about. It's very easy to become distracted by some of the other things going on in the market through, you know, be it public or private. I think at the end of the day, it's very important to keep focused on what's crucial, which is making sure that patients have access to medicine.
And perhaps here is quite a pertinent and current topic to bring up. COVID-19, coronavirus. For you guys at Atlas, how are you going about addressing, you know, the issues and the shockwaves that have been sent through companies and institutions globally as a result of COVID-19? Sort of what are the sort of implications for a cannabis producer, and what are you guys doing specifically to mitigate the impact of COVID-19?
That's a good question, and something I think that's on everybody's mind right now, because there is a lot of unknowns. From a business standpoint, Atlas is, you know, in a position where we're revenue generating, and we haven't released our results from Q1 of this year, but they're quite positive in contrast to many of our peers. I suppose because of that corporate structure and the strategies that we had early on, we're able to weather some of the initial impact, I think, of COVID. Although we need to be, of course, very cognizant of the fact that this may not be over quickly. Most immediately had about 15% of our staff that self-isolated from the cultivation side, just, you know, for their own fear, I suppose, of becoming infected, understandably. So we try to be as supportive as we can with the staff. The Canadian government, luckily, has been quite supportive. On the European side, it's extremely challenging because, well, international travel has obviously basically ceased. So that is a little bit challenging for myself because I can't be necessarily going back and forth. Luckily, we do have some great partners overseas that we work with that can keep things rolling while we're unable to travel there. One of the other things that we decided to do, just as of last week, just given the uncertainty with COVID, was to offer a convertible debenture through our Canadian company to help just basically make sure that not only do we have a really long runway in the case that we can't, say, access new capital on the European side in the short term, that we can bring it all together through and loan funds from the Canadian company to the Danish company to help just keep things going there. where it is expensive, obviously, to, do construction and equipment and all these other things. So the timing isn't ideal of COVID. There's no doubt about it. But we've tried to mitigate that by just making sure that we put some fresh capital in the bank and doing that strategically to offer a low risk opportunity for investors while also taking advantage of the entire strategy that we've already put in place.
I feel that sort of leads into perhaps a more general global markets perspective. It's no secret that cannabis companies have been mullered in public markets over the past few months, and raising capital's hard. And now with Corona, there's going to be an even slower influx of capital. How well are you guys going to weather the storm?
Yeah, it's definitely no secret. The markets got completely hammered. Unfortunately, I think every company, regardless of your focus and your integrity of your team, is kind of painted with the same brush currently from some of our peers that may have done things unethically or motivation of greed. That being said, because of our core focus and maintaining the focus on what we've been doing, we've still been able to actually raise additional capital even recently. And I do believe we're going to have quite good success with this convertible offering. But I mean, overall, no one's immune to the way that the market is right now and in cannabis, but even outside of cannabis with the macroeconomics of, if you look at the whole market, it's suffering in every sector. That being said, our strategies, and really the primary strategy, is make profit. So as long as we can keep turning cash flow from a business perspective, we're good either way. Luckily, Canada has been basically deeming cannabis as essential. So we're not in a forced shutdown or anything like that. So that does help. But as a mitigation strategy, because we don't really know what the future holds, that's where we wanted to provide a good and healthy offering to people that are still willing to or interested in the market. Because to be honest, I think there's quite a few people that have sat on the sidelines. Well, I know there's quite a few people, investor-wise and institutions, that have just sat on the sidelines and kind of watched the market unfold through the hot and the cold period that we've seen as the cannabis market expanded globally, publicly and privately. But I mean, most people are privy to the public side of it. Atlas is a private company. So we have been able to kind of avoid some of that market turmoil and undue scrutiny as well as distraction. And I think that really is the reason why we're in a position that we are now, where we have a really clear pathway and a strong viability as a business. And I do think that this next couple of years is going to allow companies like Atlas to emerge into the market globally, having flown under the radar, so to speak, over the last few years, allowed us to kind of build our war chest of IP and other things.
And I'm glad you've mentioned the war chest of IP, because I think that's something that I certainly wanted to hear about. So are you able to walk us through the studies that you're doing with Harvard and Alberta, perhaps at a high level on the studies? And more of interest to our listeners would be, how do you take it from the heads of the boffins onto the shelves of pharmacies?
So that's a challenge, no doubt. I'll run through at a high level just because I can't really disclose the internal workings per se specifically of some of these studies. But I can tell you ultimately what we're doing is we've created formulations that have targeted outcomes. So Harvard, where Atlas Biotech and Atlas Growers are founding members of their Phytomedicines Institute. Actually, Atlas is, as far as I know, currently the only company that can actually export cannabis to the United States. I believe Tilray executed one shipment at some point way in the past. Otherwise, yeah, we have a DEA exemption and Health Canada permits to actually transfer product across the border to Harvard so that they can do these R&D and trials. The focus of the Harvard study is neurological disorders. That's fairly broad. There are specific ones that we're targeting. Unfortunately, I just can't release the details of what those are specifically at the moment because Harvard will release that information. There is 3 studies I can speak a little bit more transparently about that we're doing with the University of Alberta here in Canada. They're related to Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, and multiple sclerosis. And what we've done is we've designed specific formulations that, in our opinion and our scientists' opinions, should treat those ailments effectively. And for us right now, the main goal is proving that efficacy. Once you prove that efficacy, that's how we can kind of take it from those scientists and put it into the hands of patients while also making a claim about the effect that we expect it to provide to that patient. I think, as we all know, it's difficult because you can't really make medical claims about anything to do with the plant, regardless of whether you know or think it would work for that particular patient without the proof. So our main goal in these partnerships is to get the efficacy data needed to give the confidence to doctors. In a place like the UK, I think that's more important than almost anywhere, but also in Denmark and in Germany as well. And more so even in North America from a medical standpoint. And
without wanting you to commit to a specific timeline, because in any industry, that's always pretty tough, but especially in these testing global times, sort of predicting timelines for things has gone almost somewhat out of the window. But sort of in your internal conversations, in your conversations with your research partners, broadly speaking, how long might you expect until these products are ready for commercialization?
So the timeline to commercialization obviously may be affected by the COVID crisis, but we do expect to bring certain formulations to market in either the fourth quarter of 2020 or the first quarter of 2021 with certain claims available. And then we have other formulations that we're releasing into market in the summer of this year in North America exclusively to start, so in Canada. But we do expect to bring some of those more simple formulations to Europe as well as quickly as possible, but not with any claims attached to them. So for instance, we have a formulation that's a sleep aid. So it's just kind of a simple formulation that we put together that we don't really have to prove the efficacy of. And we know what the outcome is going to be for a patient or for someone who's using that as basically a healthy alternative sleep aid.
Now, if possible, I'd like to move it on to a slightly different tack. So I'd like our listeners to find out a little bit more about you as a leader. Now, as the CEO of a cannabis business and one that's expanded internationally, there must have been and must be on a daily basis a huge amount for you to deal with. How have you found this journey that you've been on with regards to your leadership and how you've approached your scaling teams, growing amount of partners and increased pressures that are a result of the increased growth activity and operations that you have?
I think for me, it's been one of the most challenging, but one of the most rewarding and incredible experiences of my life. I know that when I look at a business and from an outside perspective, I look for a few key things from the management team, consistency and positive focus and caring mentality for the staff. As the CEO of Atlas, I work to make sure that all the staff, from a trimmer to a senior executive, are motivated and empowered to be able to do their jobs, but also to be able to have the freedom to be creative and innovative. I believe that the most important part of building a business, especially in an environment like this, but really in general, no matter what you're doing, is a focus on creativity and innovation. So being able to have the freedom for someone in the lab, say, to put something together that they think would be something that would work or might be good for us to put into a study, say, is something I completely encourage. Maybe if it's on the corporate end, allowing, say, a manager or a business development person, for instance, to be able to explore channels that they believe might work as far as getting product out there, or as far as opening a door overseas, or working with a processing hub in Malta or wherever it might be. Those are things that I encourage. And what that's really led to is, of course, challenge, but of course, also new opportunities that would have never happened had I not encouraged those kind of activities and just given people the leniency and flexibility to pursue kind of the ambitions that they have. I don't believe that any one person knows how to best navigate this industry, the way it started, the way it's built, and the way it's going. And outside of this industry, I don't know, with all the stuff going on, obviously, what the best way is to navigate it. But I think, just for me, sticking to my guns of what I believe is the right approach has been quite helpful. And I mean, from my perspective, it's, I believe, a good way to keep the staff, motivated and gearing towards a positive outcome, regardless of all the health and economic related issues going on in the world right now.
And we've spoken about staff, but something that I'd be keen to pick your brain on as well is how do you ensure that the company culture, the values that are core to Atlas growers are also enacted by and aligned with those new local partners that you are taking on board, be it in Denmark or perhaps any other locations, folks that aren't directly maybe employees of Atlas, but are very much part of the Atlas operation and wider family?
That's a good question. I can tell you I've met probably, I don't know how many, but well over 100 different companies in the space that Atlas has considered some form of relationship with, be it a strategic partnership or joint ventures or co-investment or whatever it is. It really does come down to me, at least, and I think other leaders might have different views of this, but I believe that one of the key things is understanding who the upper management is in any company that we do business with. So we typically will get to know the people that we're working with quite well on somewhat of a personal level before we really jump into any particular relationship. So that might be a cultivation partner in Canada or a processing partner overseas or in Canada. And what that looks like is making sure that there's synergies to start with. So making sure we align on our core focus. And I can tell you, Atlas's vision is to create the world's most trusted cannabis products. So in line with that vision, it's always important that we're trying to find other companies that maintain the integrity and basically the standards that we need to see in order for us to be able to have confidence that they can help us achieve that vision more effectively and more broadly, but without any sacrificing along the way on quality or consistency that may inadvertently affect a patient if things aren't consistent and at a high level.
So Sheldon, as we move to the end of the episode, I'd like to ask about perhaps more of the Nostradamus prediction, the things that we won't hold you to, but what's your feeling about how the growth of the cannabis market in Europe will look? As a company who's made a sizable investment, doing some napkin maths, if your Edmonton facility can do 5 kilos, your Danish one can do about 20, which is currently about double the size of the European market. You're anticipating a huge growth in cannabis consumption. Do you see that coming solely through medical, solely through Germany, or are you spotting other nooks and crannies where we might be able to get cannabinoids to the people who need them?
I would say that we're definitely spotting other nooks and crannies. I do expect there'll be a rise in cannabis use in Europe, medically at minimum. I don't really think that recreational cannabis is going to be legal, and at least not broadly across Europe, for a very long time. I mean, who knows? Obviously, it's yet to be proven and seen, but the beauty of our Danish facility is it's completely scalable. So the facility is already built with 36 different grow chambers and processing zones. So we don't actually need to use that entire space at all times. We can kind of work through, I guess, scale as demand increases in Europe. But I do think that you're going to see a consistent increase. And then you mentioned nooks and crannies. So that's where, at the end of the day, our focus, being a medical focused company, is breaking down the plant into its different cannabinoids and then formulating using those cannabinoids. And I do believe that there's a large market for those different cannabinoids if you use them properly and market them properly to provide a specific outcome for a patient.
And one of the things you touched upon earlier in the episode is that the Danish facility you have is actually a repurposed mushroom facility. Now, looking into mushrooms and other potential therapeutic components that can be used in future medicines, is this something that Atlas have been looking at all, expanding outside of the cannabis realm, or have you got sort of your hands full enough as they are?
We have thought about it, but currently we have no specific plans to delve down the path of things like psychedelics, or despite the fact that the facility was growing mushrooms, it was growing normal mushrooms. But, viability of growing mushrooms on scale for grocery stores and whatnot didn't really hold, there's not a ton of profit in doing that. But the beauty of that particular facility is it's a very tightly controlled environment, and that gives us the opportunity. But yeah, no, currently we're just sticking to cannabis, trying to keep focused on that side of things, and no real near-term plans to be delving outside of that, well, from any standpoint, actually.
Well, I think that is probably all we've got time for today. Sheldon, thank you very much for being our guest. We've really enjoyed having you.
Oscar, Jonathan, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate it, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Where do they go? The smoke rings I blow each night.
Well, dear listeners, as ever, we hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you did enjoy it, we would ask you to do us one small favor, or maybe two. 3 now that I think about it. Like, subscribe, and share with a friend or relative, perhaps one in lockdown who needs something to while away the time, or a professional in this industry. They'd probably be most interested. In fact, you know what, listener? I trust you. You decide to whom you should best share this pod with, and do so. Thank you, and for now, goodbye.
Hello, please take me above. Take me with you.